Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Wind Through the Keyhole by Stephen King. Now, The Wind Through the Keyhole was published in 2012, and this is the 8th book of Stephen King's Dark Tower series. Now, the actual storyline for this series ended in book 7, however, continuity-wise, this book is actually set between the events of books 4 and 5 of this series, so technically you could call this the Dark Tower 4.5. Now, I've already read all the Dark Tower books before, but for the past few months I have been rereading and reviewing all the Dark Tower novels in preparation for the new film adaptation of the Dark Tower series, which is out already, and I have seen the movie, and I actually already recorded my review of the movie, but I wanted to wait till I reviewed this book before I actually put up my review of the movie. Now, the Dark Tower series is a series of fantasy novels written by Stephen King, and the series is primarily set in an alternate universe known as Midworld, and the series follows this gunslinger named Roland, who throughout the series is looking for this thing called the Dark Tower, which actually holds the time-space continuum together, and it turns out that there's this demon called the Crimson King who wants to destroy the Dark Tower, which will destroy reality as we know it, and throughout the series Roland teams up with some people from our world who join him on this quest for the tower. Now, The Wind Through the Keyhole actually follows a very similar narrative structure to that of the 4th Dark Tower novel, Wizard and Glass, in that this is a story within the story. However, this book actually goes one further than Wizard and Glass in that this is actually a story within the story within the story. Essentially, this book is 3 stories in one, and each story is wrapped within the other. Now, the plot of The Wind Through the Keyhole is it picks up where Wizard and Glass left off. However, it's set sometime before the events of the 5th Dark Tower novel, Wolves of the Calla, but in the beginning of the novel, Roland and the rest of his Ka-Tet, which is Eddie, Susanna, Jake, and Oi, are continuing on the path of the beam leading towards the Dark Tower, and at one point they have to get across this river, and they're taken across the river by an elderly ferryman, and the ferryman warns them of a storm that is coming, a very powerful and deadly storm known as a Stark Blast. So the Ka-Tet end up taking shelter from this storm in this building in this old abandoned town, and to pass the time, Roland ends up telling his friends 2 stories. However, one story is wrapped in the other. So the first story that Roland tells the Ka-Tet is about something that happened to him when he was a teenager, shortly after the flashback sequences that you saw in Wizard and Glass, and this thing that happened to him as a teenager also took place shortly before the Battle of Jericho Hill, which was the great battle where all the gunslingers, except for Roland, were killed off. The second story that Roland tells the Ka-Tet is actually a story that Roland's mother used to tell him when he was a child, and this is a story about something that happened in Midworld generations before Roland was born. So, in the first story that Roland tells the Ka-Tet, which once again is taking place when Roland was a teenager, Roland's father Stephen sends Roland and his friend Jamie to this small town to investigate this series of horrific murders, and people believe that these murders are actually the work of a skin man. Now, a skin man is sort of like a werewolf in a way, only a skin man can change into any animal, not just a wolf, and a skin man can actually choose to become an animal. It's not like a curse that is put on him, it's something that he chooses. So, Roland and Jamie go to this town to try to figure out if, for one, if these murders really are the work of a skin man, and if they are, to figure out who the skin man actually is. And they end up meeting this little boy who actually witnessed one of the skin man's attacks. And to comfort this little boy, Roland ends up telling him a story that his mother used to tell him when he was a child, and this story is titled The Wind Through the Keyhole, which is the story within the story within the story that actually ends up taking up most of the book. Now, The Wind Through the Keyhole is supposed to be an old legend or a fairy tale that has existed in Midworld for generations, and Stephen King very much leaves it up to interpretation whether this is something that actually happened in Midworld only generations before Roland was born, or if it's just a story. Now, I personally buy the Wind Through the Keyhole story as something that actually happened in this universe, only because of a certain character who shows up in the Wind Through the Keyhole segment of this novel. Now, the plot of the Wind Through the Keyhole segment of this novel is it follows this young boy named Tim. Now, in the beginning of the story, Tim's father is killed by a dragon, or so Tim and his mother are told, and Tim's mother ends up remarrying, and she marries Tim's father's best friend. Now, this man that Tim's mother ends up marrying, who was his father's best friend, turns out to be a raging alcoholic and also a misogynist, and he's extremely abusive towards Tim's mother as well as Tim. Now, in the story, there's this sinister tax collector known as the Covenant Man who comes to this village every year, and it turns out that the Covenant Man might be immortal because it turns out that the Covenant Man has been coming to this town since Tim's mother was a little girl, and Tim's mother says that he hasn't aged a day, and you eventually find out that the Covenant Man is actually a wizard, and the Covenant Man ends up showing Tim some dark secrets about his new stepfather. Now, at a certain point in the story, Tim's stepfather accuses Tim's mother of something that Tim actually did, and he ends up severely beating her, and he beats her so badly that she actually goes blind. So, Tim wants desperately to save his mother's sight, so the Covenant Man shows him this vision of him meeting the wizard Merlin, who of course is based on the Merlin from Legends of King Arthur. But what happens is, in this vision, Tim sees himself meeting Merlin in the woods, and Merlin gives him something to save his mother's sight. So, the Covenant Man ends up sending Tim on this journey deep into the woods to find Merlin, but of course the Covenant Man doesn't actually think Tim is going to come back alive. But Tim is determined to find Merlin and save his mother's sight no matter what. Now, the main reason why I buy the Wind Through the Keyhole segment of this book as being something that actually happened in Midworld, as opposed to just a story that Roland's mother told him, is because the villain of the story, the Covenant Man, is so clearly supposed to be Randall Flagg, who is a major villain in this series, and King doesn't even try to hide the fact that this is Flagg. Now, this is a pretty good book, however, I definitely think the Wind Through the Keyhole segment of this novel is by far the best thing about this whole book. Now, a lot of people say you should read this right after you read Wizard and Glass and right before you read Wolves of the Calla. I personally disagree with that because this book is so similar to Wizard and Glass in terms of how it's structured that I feel like if you read this right after you read Wizard and Glass, it will just feel super repetitive, I think. I personally think you should just read the initial 7 books and then read this book. And I honestly almost consider this book to be more of a Dark Tower spin-off novel as opposed to an actual Dark Tower novel. And once again, it's not a bad book by any means, I just don't think it's a necessary book to read in terms of the overall Dark Tower series. The only thing that I do think this book adds a little bit is it sort of gives you a little bit of closure to the relationship between Roland and his mother, because in the first Dark Tower novel and in Wizard and Glass, you realize that Roland had a very strained relationship with his mother, and you found out at the end of Wizard and Glass what happened to his mother, and I feel like this book sort of gives you some closure in terms of Roland's relationship with his mother, but to me that's really one of the only things that this book adds to the overall Dark Tower mythos. And one thing I do actually really like about this book is Roland telling this little boy the Wind Through the Keyhole story actually does work kind of thematically, because in a lot of ways the Wind Through the Keyhole story, him telling it is almost his way of apologizing to his mother, because it's a story that his mother used to tell him a lot. And once again, this book does give you some closure to the relationship between Roland and his mother, and that is the one thing I really did like about this book. And once again, it's a good book. I just don't think it's a necessary book. And honestly, I find the weakest parts of this novel to be the opening and the closing of the novel, which deal with Roland and the rest of his Ka-Tet waiting out the Stark Blast. However, I do really like the stories within the story, though. Like, the Skin Man segments of this novel really do work as sort of a supernatural murder mystery slash horror western story, whereas the Wind Through the Keyhole segment of this novel works as a piece of high fantasy. But once again, the Wind Through the Keyhole, it's a good book, but in my opinion, it feels more like a Dark Tower spin-off novel as opposed to an actual Dark Tower novel. And I do recommend the book, however, I recommend reading the first 7 books before you read this book, even though this book is set between the events of books 4 and 5. I don't think this book would really add to the overall story. But yeah, that's my review on the Wind Through the Keyhole, and bye.